I'd like to welcome you to the Teahouse for today's topic, cultural appropriation versus appreciation. We have 90 minutes together and we encourage you to steep your favorite tea and get comfortable. Culture is the jewel of humanity, and in light of the complex intersection between culture, history, and politics, participation in each other's cultural practices calls for sensitivity, mutual respect, and discussion. Our goal today is to have a friendly and compassionate conversation in the tea room and find a way to navigate this complex landscape so that everyone can enjoy tea culture free of ambiguity, shame, or disrespect. I, Marco, will be moderating today's discussion and Q&A segment toward the end. I'd like to provide some brief house rules before we dive in, and I allow both Sohan and Ray to introduce themselves. We ask that, one, you remain muted throughout the panel events before we open it up to the Q&A portion. If you have questions or comments, feel free to utilize the chat box during this time at the bottom of your screen. I'll be reviewing them for the last segment of the day. We'll leave about 20 minutes for open Q&A segment. And then, of course, the Tea House is a place of connectedness, and we're happy to see your faces. If you, for any reason, need to step away or to feel most comfortable, feel free to turn off your computer screen so that you're most comfortable.
If you have any questions, let me know.
There we go. In terms of introductions now, I'd like to allow our panelists the chance to introduce themselves, beginning with Ray, founder and CEO of Grass People Tree, before passing it on to Sohan, owner of West China Tea.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ray, Liu Ray. My name is Liu Ray by birth, and I grew up in southwest of China, a province called Guizhou, where I think Sohan has been a couple of times now. And the reason for me to found Grass People Tree is actually to add a different narratives to tea culture and the way we perceive tea. I feel very honored today to be here, share a little bit of my perception of tea culture and appropriation and appreciation with Sohan and Marco. And thank you everyone for joining in. Very excited to explore together.
Thank you, Ray. Sohan is next.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Ray. My name's Sohan Fan. I'm the founder of West China Tea, and I'm Chinese American, and I grew up in the United States. Being seen as a Chinese person, although I'm American, I was always seen as not being exactly an American. And then, my interactions with Ray really helped to open up this kind of idea, like, wow, there are these things that we experience as Chinese and Chinese descended people in the tea industry that we all kind of keep to ourselves and we don't talk about them necessarily. And lately with Ray and with Annie and with other people, there have been these discussions emerging that it's like, oh, wow, that happens to you too. You think about that too. You encounter this as well. It's not just me. And so what I'm really want to do today is to open up that discussion instead of this being an unspoken process kind of running in the background, to actually open up the discussion so that people can feel like we've got discourse around it. We have some clarity and consensus around this very sensitive issue.
Thank you, Sohan, and thank you, Ray, again for your introduction. And that leads right into, in terms of providing context and clarity for the session itself. Let's take a look at the first question, which is, what are your personal takes and definitions of appropriation and appreciation within this context?
You want to start, Ray? You want me to do it? I can do it if you want. So, yeah, Ray, yeah? Cool. So these words are the make up the heart of the discussion today. These two words, appropriation and appreciation. And if you look up the word appropriation, it means stealing, essentially, taking something that is not yours and using it as though it is your own. And then appreciation is, well, you know, that's a very common word. We use the word to appreciate, but it means to have respect and affinity for something, and to see the value in it, even if it's not yours. You know, you can appreciate a work of art. It's not your art. You can appreciate someone else's effort. It's not your effort, but you're giving respect to it, and you're also, you know, admiring it and enjoying it. And so, obviously, when people who are the vast majority of people that I interact with through tea culture are not Chinese. This tea house, people come into this tea house. We do have a lot of Chinese people come in, but the majority are not Chinese. And the majority of people who watched the YouTube show, Going Fu Tea Cha and Teahouse Ghost, are by and large not Chinese descended people. And that's great. And for many years, I've been like, oh, this is our mission, is to like help everybody to appreciate Chinese tea culture, to help everybody enjoy Chinese tea culture. And the first time that I encountered this idea of appropriation was people who love tea, non-Chinese people, would come to me, you know, this is in like 2012, 2013, and be like, hey, Sohan, I love your show and I love making tea, but I'm worried that if I make tea, I'm not Chinese, am I appropriating Chinese culture? And back then my answer was like, nah, don't worry about it. Chinese people love when foreigners do Chinese stuff. Like, it's all good in the hood. Don't think about it. It's like, it's just social justice warriors who talk about that. Like, no, Chinese people aren't bothered by it. And then as time went on, and you started to see more non-Chinese and non-Chinese descended people enter the not just the community of tea lovers, but also tea merchants, tea vendors, and you started to see people who are not of Chinese descent really defining the narrative, defining the discourse around what is Gong Fu Cha, what is correct Chinese tea culture, what is appropriate, what are the right answers to these things. And I started to see a lot of non-Chinese people really taking control of that narrative, oftentimes being at odds with people who were of Chinese descent and who had been to China and had spent time in China. And then seeing the way that those people had credibility above and beyond people like Rui and myself, who are of Chinese descent, Rui being actually from China, and who speak Chinese and who go to China and who interact with these people as the mainstay of our livelihood and our lifestyle. And so that's when I started to feel like, okay, now I understand why this discussion about appropriation is important. So yeah, I guess for me, the very good definition is appropriation is when you take something that is not your own, and you either take credit from those who did create it and seize that credit and present it as your own, or you are taking control of the narrative or taking a position of authority in a field that does not belong to your culture. And there's a lot of issues of privilege come into play with that. And then appreciation is when you are respecting and enjoying the culture on its terms, not trying to impose your own definitions and your own terms onto it, and absolutely giving credit to those who created the culture. And I'm checked.
Thank you.
I think Sohan shared many layers just by saying what you're saying. And today I actually went on Cambridge Dictionary to check what appropriation means. And I just wanted to, as an extension of what Sohan just shared, I wanted to share this English translation of what appropriation means, and also to give my own definition as of today. So appropriation by Cambridge Dictionary, it says the act of taking something such as an idea, custom, or style from a group or culture that you are not a member of, or using it yourself. So I think there are two things here are not very clear to me. which is what does it mean by you're not a member of, and what does it mean by you using it yourself? So it could mean a lot of different things. So here I've written what I feel like what cultural appropriation means, particularly in my journey of running Grass People Tree. I wanted to say here before I share this is that it's a very personal thing to me in terms of this definition. Cultural appropriation to me hasn't been a concept that I was familiar with when I was drinking tea, when I was growing up. It wasn't quite a concept. But as I was sharing tea in the international tea community, there's a lot of things that made me uncomfortable. So here's my updated version of it. I'm going to read it a bit slowly because it's slightly longer. So cultural appropriation by Ray's take is the conscious or subconscious act of taking something such as an idea, custom, art, or style from a group, finding or recognizing its comprehensiveness, intricacy, and nuances, and taking it out of context or dismissing such context and using it for self-promotion, profit, spiritual craving, adaptation, authoritative comparison, compartmentalization, or conceptualization. I think, Marco, if you have the copy, maybe share this text. Oh, thank you for sharing. I just see it now. So this is my own definition of it as of today, and I'm sure it will keep on updating itself as my journey deepens with Grass People Tree and beyond. And in terms of appreciation, I think to me, apart from what Sohan shared, I think to me, apart from respect, there's also an implication of intention. Liking something, taking something on as your own, there's the intention of it. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you both. With this being prevalent, I wanted to ask each of you, can you share some of your personal experiences when you found that someone that fitting with these definitions is appropriating tea culture and Chinese culture, and how have you addressed that with individuals in the past?
Okay, I've got one that I can open with. I remember I was traveling. I was with Steve Odell, who I think is in the room, hopefully. One of my very dear friends, tea brother, and co-collaborator in tea sourcing and owner of Teahouse. This is before all that, before either of us had any tea houses or anything. We were just traveling through China, having a great time and exploring and finding all these cool teas, getting yellow tea and these guyu cha and all these rare and unusual teas. And we went to Taiwan, and we went to a community in Taiwan made up of non-Taiwanese people who were dedicated to tea culture. And they had like a building where they all lived together, and they are all part of this tea business, and they worked together to build tea culture. And it was great. I was very, very excited to visit this place because I really respected what they were doing. And the head of this organization is not a Chinese person, although he uses a Chinese name. He gives Chinese names to his students who are not Chinese people. He wears Chinese clothes. And like I said, this is someone I had a huge amount of respect for, and I was very excited to go to this place. And we showed up, and the reception that we got was very different than I expected. We showed up, we had just come from China, from mainland China, going to all these homeland, the homeland of tea. And we had been going, and we were coming into a tea community, and I was expecting that to be like, excited. I was excited to be there, and I expected that they would be excited that we were there because we were coming with all of this stuff and this knowledge and this tea. And we wanted to share it and just genuinely be like it is when like we hang out, you know, you and me, Marco, or you and me, Ray, you know, like when we hang out, we're just so excited to be with other tea people. And the reception that Steve and I got was a little bit, it was just unusual. I had someone who was not the leader of this organization, but one of his like disciples. When I told her that we had been traveling through China and that we'd had all this tea, her first response was, "Oh, well, all the tea in China is toxic." And I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, we just drank Da Hong Pao. You know, just today we sat together and drank Da Hong Pao. That's from the Wuyi Mountains. That's a Chinese tea." And she said, "Well, our organization can get clean ones, but what you can find in China is all toxic. We know, like our leader knows how to get the good ones, but everything else out there is toxic." And she'd never been to China. This is a person who had never been to mainland China. She had just been to this one little spot in Taiwan, and she hadn't even been around Taiwan either. She didn't speak Chinese, and she didn't have any direct experience of working with tea people. But she had this strong degree of confidence that felt like prejudice to me. When she said, tea in China is toxic, that felt like all of this stereotyping of Chinese people as being crooked, as being dirty, as Chinese foods and products being poisonous and toxic that I've experienced my whole life as a Chinese American. This idea that made in China is inherently a bad thing. And then to say, oh, but our leader, who is a white person, who is a non-Chinese person, he can be trusted, and what he gets and brings over is clean and safe. And she didn't go with him. She just trusts him. You know, she has a baseline level of trust for him that did not need to be demonstrated or proven or earned in any direct way. But she was saying to me, I don't trust you. I don't believe that you can go and get clean tea from China. I'm going to assume that our leader can and that you can't. And that felt very discriminatory for me, to the point where I felt like the narrative of what tea was and what good tea was had been taken by this organization, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and had created this idea or reinforced this idea that tea from China is dirty and toxic, and that the only way to get clean tea that's trustworthy is to have a non-Chinese person, a white person, signing off on it and saying, no, this is okay. I promise this one's okay. And that felt very appropriative to me. And that's one little one, but I'm going to open it up for Ray.
Thank you for sharing this, Sohan. I hear you. There's I wanted to ask you, maybe after I share mine, perhaps how you deal with it emotionally, because I think it'd be quite interesting to know as I will share mine. Because so I wanted to make a disclaimer before I go ahead and share my story. It's very personal. And also I wanted to share here, since we're within the safe place in West China Tea's community, and also within the global tea community. So I trust that I can share whatever information there is, but I'd like to invite everyone not to take things out of context here. I'm going to name the organizations that is involved in my experience, because I believe that if we're constantly talking about these experiences without saying it, it's just going to be another one of those, which is not going to be really helpful. So I would trust your own judgment, but I also wanted to say this is my personal experience as a Chinese person sharing Guizhou culture outside of Guizhou, outside of China. So the story goes, a few years ago, I was invited to go share a workshop about Guizhou tea a tea workshop, a tea tasting at so I was invited to go and host the event there. And so I went, and we were tasting, I think, 5 to 7 different types of tea. And within that, I shared a tea which is called Slow Mellow Yellow. Some of you might have tasted the tea before. So when I was sharing the tea during the workshop, I was talking about the processing methods of Slow Mellow Yellow, which was actually one of those very rare tea in terms of the culture, because Guizhou yellow tea is very different to how yellow tea is made in other regions, because tea, as like food, it has its regionality. So when I was sharing yellow tea about the processing, within the Yi people, the indigenous Yi people, they have a very specific way of oxidizing the tea by making the tea into a wet parcel, a paper parcel, and then using the fire to oxidize it. So as I was explaining the procedures of making this tea, I was corrected by the host saying, literally interrupting me and said, what Ray meant was not oxidizing. What Ray meant was fermentation, because yellow tea has to go through fermentation process. So that was at the time when such comment was made. I didn't go confront this person who is the owner of. And later on, after the event was finished, I discovered that the founder, the person who made the blog post, she went and wrote about it and said something like, I realized that I made this point to correct Ray, which is, but I recognize that tea has its regionality, etc., but without telling me about it. It was never apologized to me or mentioned anything. So it was then mentioned to her community as a way of a good PR from my perception, but it didn't involve me. So not that it didn't involve me as a personally, but it didn't involve the way how it was presented and how it was dealt with. So there are two, so within this, there are two layers of things here. So one is dismissing of my experience of where sort of the lineage of where the tea came from. And the other one is using that as so it's further appropriating that into a PR stunt and making it to look good from my perspective. So this has, it took me literally years to stand here today and to share with you guys, because now it's gained a lot of clarity. And also over the years, over the months, emotional side of things sort of diluted. Now I can speak it very clearly. But it was really challenging for me when I was confronted at the event about something about my own culture that was dismissed. So this is just one of those many experiences. And a lot of what I come across, some of them are very similar to this one. And so coming back to the emotional side of things, I wanted to ask Sohan, when you went to Taiwan and saw how that was dealt with, how did you then sort of digest it over the years, and how do you deal with it?
Thank you so much, Ray, for sharing that very difficult and challenging story. I could feel your discomfort as you shared it, and I could feel the feeling of I don't know, like the trauma of that experience, having had stuff like that happen to me also. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that in the moment, you don't realize that it's being done because it's so shocking. It's so disrespectful. It's like if someone just came up and just like grabbed something out of your hand and you're just standing there like, because it doesn't seem reasonable that someone would think that would be a way that you would talk to somebody. And certainly if you were to turn the tables, and it took me years, like you said, it took me years of digesting and being mad about it. You know, I was mad. I felt mad and offended, and I felt, and it took me years to realize I was actually being discriminated against, or that Chinese people in general were being discriminated against. The assumption is that although tea is Chinese, and Chinese tea culture at least is Chinese and comes from China, Chinese people can't be trusted with it. On our side, it's, well, the farmers that you met are liars, and they're telling you that the tea is clean, but it's not. And yeah, exactly. These would qualify as microaggressions, or I don't know, maybe macroaggressions, but you know, being interrupted mid-sentence is very disrespectful. And I don't imagine that if the tables had been turned, you interrupting her mid-sentence and correcting her on something she was saying would just not be tolerated. It would just be completely inconceivable and out of the question. And yet, on the other hand, she feels like she can do this casually and only in retrospect be like, oh, sorry about that. But again, she didn't have to swallow her pride and actually apologize to you. It wasn't about what she did to you as a person and the way that she undermined your credibility. It was about the way that she might be seen as being inappropriate by her audience. And yeah, as for how I deal with it emotionally, at first I'm kind of numb and I don't realize what's going on. And then it takes me, it took me so long to process what had happened and be like, what happened to me in Taiwan was that clearly this person did not come up with this idea on her own that Chinese tea is toxic. It appears to me, and after talking to other people at this organization, that this is part of their narrative, is that tea, the world of tea is full of toxic tea, and in China is full of toxic tea, and that you need a trustworthy guide. And the dog whistle there is a white person. You need a trustworthy white person because white people don't lie like Chinese people do. Chinese people are liars and cheats, and they'll sell you stuff that's toxic, but this knowledgeable white person can be your guide, who has a Chinese name can be your guide. And he is our authority on tea. And I think one of the most appropriative things, well, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but to answer your question, emotionally, I get angry and upset, and I even think about it. You know, I stay up at night and I replay it in my mind, the degree to which that's so traumatic. And if something like that wouldn't traumatize you, it probably means that you have privilege. You know what I mean? That if it's, for example, when people I've always heard this thing from white people defending the use of the N-word, you know, saying, oh, well, Black people can use the N-word, why can't I use it? And if someone calls me a honky or a cracker, I don't get mad about it, you know? And that's just the point. Those words don't have the power of the N-word because there's not a whole system of abuse and trauma behind them. In the same way, I think that if the idea of being corrected mid-sentence by someone who does not know what they're talking about, or if the idea is being told that you're not credible, doesn't sound like it would bother you, check to see if you are from a culture that gets the benefit of the doubt. Are you from this side that does get the trust and the benefit of the doubt? Did you not grow up having people assume that you were a liar because of the way that you look? That might be why you don't feel those things. But yeah, the degree to which it is traumatic and that it sticks with you and really haunts you is can't be overstated. And to be honest, I ruminate on them and I get angry and upset and I think about them and I write and I talk to other people, and now we're doing this. And I think this is very much not that this is like a vengeance axe to grind thing, but it's a discussion that needs to get had. And I'm tired of having this discussion one person at a time, because it's a discussion that needs to get had with the entire tea community because it's relevant.
Sohan and Ray, thank you so much for expressing the frustration and the subtleties when you've seen this happen to both of you. What, in your experience, a lot of this was, how do you work through this and confront these challenges emotionally? Is there a time or a situation where you've confronted the person that has facilitated this sort of appropriation, and those conversations? How have you found that you've had to go about facilitating that learning on someone else's part?
I will share this because I recently just had one. And it's still very fresh in my memory. So, so there's someone who was running a sort of like a workshop about Chinese New Year and what it means, the water element, etc. And so since it was, I wouldn't say confronted Marco here, but because my situation was a bit different here. So I'm gonna share her name. Her name runs a workshop that shares about the water element of the Tiger Year. And within that, so I signed up to it because I wanted to learn how people who don't speak Chinese, who are not taught in Chinese cosmology, Chinese ancient science, how do they share this sort of thing? So I came in with an open mind just to learn. So when I went in there and I realized, so it was showing some slides. First of all, there's a slide of a screenshot of what water is. So there's the evolution of the writing of water, but below that there was a section, a paragraph written in Chinese explaining what water means. So actually it means in ancient Chinese, when we wrote the character water, shui, it actually means river. It also actually means everything that moves. So there's a lot of meaning within that, just that screenshot. But because of she doesn't grasp these nuances, then it went on and on into something that I couldn't follow. So first of all, I felt really, really uncomfortable, because later on she shared a lot of things about the earthly branches and things like that, which I think then could lead the audience to feel the idea that the ancient Chinese way of looking at things being mystified. And I have my own experience of, because people don't understand things properly, they tend to make it an easier option to explain it, which is, to me, is taking things out of context, but understandably so, because you don't speak the language and you don't understand the nuances and the sort of different implications of it. So it bugged me for a few weeks, and I reached out to her. I said, hey, I have some feedback I would like to share with you about the experience I had. So we had a tea together, and it was very uncomfortable for the both of us, because I knew I was gonna point out something to her, and I knew that I was gonna say something that was gonna make her feel very uncomfortable. But in the middle of feeling very angry about this, is that I realized how difficult it must have been for somebody who is so interested in ancient Chinese wisdom but limited because of the language barrier, because of a lack of a good teacher or good teachers, and because of the lack of experience of actually living in China. She actually has lived in China, but she's never, you know, like growing up there or anything. So my sort of feedback was given. I decided to give her feedback on the basis of standing in her shoes, and to give her all the resources that she needs from my point of view, from my own sort of angle, so that she knows whenever she needs anything to be checked, then I'm here for her. It took me a while to get there, but I think once we're there and both understood the difficulties that we're both facing, which is a very difficult conversation, and being very honest towards each other, and giving sort of openness and compassion to it, and then it's sort of what is supposed to be confrontation becomes a bit softer. So that tends to be my way of dealing with things nowadays, because I feel like people are going to take the culture, they're going to take these things on. They have followers. They are going to run courses. They are going to be talking about this, and they are going to be quoting things that are in English, and they're not going to understand it within a day, a month, or a year. So instead of sort of pointing at them to say you're not doing it right, then at least for what I can do is to say, I can check 5 dictionaries for you. That's the least I can do. Or I can do this, I can do that. So this literally happened two weeks ago, and we've been sharing Chinese poems to each other since. So from that, I learned a lot in terms of like how to sort of put myself in other people's shoes, and to understand how difficult it must have been for them as well.
Thank you, Ray. That's beautiful. I was wondering, I remember because you told me, we spoke a couple of weeks ago when we were planning this year, like, I'm about to go to this workshop. I was like, okay, hope it goes well.
When I was talking to Sohan, was like, this
it is frustrating. What I think there's a lot of layers there, where it's frustrating, and you were like, this is a $3,500 workshop, you know what I mean, and that doesn't not play into it. When Ray or I do something, we're very much asked to prove ourselves again and again and again. We're asked to prove that our tea is legitimate. I had people on Reddit accusing me of taking Mary Cotterman's teapots and selling them as Chengju's teapots, because they just assume that I'm trying to cheat somehow, somewhere, because those teapots looked like Mary Cotterman's. And the fact is that Mary and Chengju designed that pot together when they were working together. And so he makes them and she makes them, and they look alike for that reason. But they didn't talk to me. They didn't ask me. They were having this discussion without me involved on Reddit. And basically coming from the baseline assumption that me, Sohan, is a liar and I'm trying to cheat in some way. But to answer the question, Marco, I almost never confront people, very rarely. Usually in the moment, I'm too stunned to realize it's happening. And then afterwards, I just don't want the confrontation. I just feel too uncomfortable about doing it. And sometimes I think about doing it and I want to, and I can't work up the courage to do it. And one of the things is that when a person who is of Chinese descent is advocating on their own behalf, you get a fragility response. Like you're talking about, Ray, when you were confronting about this, there was this discomfort going into it. And that's called, they talk about, this is called fragility. The idea that if you point out to someone that they have done something wrong or appropriative or discriminatory, then because they have the privilege to do that and get away with it, they don't have to listen to you. They can walk away from that conversation. They don't like what you're saying, they can walk away. And on the internet, you'll get a whole bunch of other people from the majority demographic who will dogpile on you and say that you're being racist. I get called racist on Facebook all the time. Why do I get called racist? For calling out racism. Because if I mention the word white, if I say white people, white person, that's racist. If I say anything about race at all, that's racist. And it's because people have fragility around this idea. They think racism is bad, therefore racists are bad. So if anyone is accusing me of doing anything racist, then I'm being accused of being a bad person. And therefore, I'm just going to cover my ears. And anytime someone says that, I will accuse them of being racist. And I can do that because other people who have that same fragility response as me will back me up, and they will dogpile on this person and say, you're such a terrible racist person. Why? Because they're the majority. And they have that privilege to speak out and not be chastised for it. And if they do get chastised for it, it doesn't matter. They can brush that off. They can say, well, these are just people playing the race card. These are just angry minorities playing the race card, looking for some reason to be bitter at me because they don't like their lives, you know, et cetera. And so that's been my experience again and again. And so I almost never confront people. Lately, in my own little world here in Austin, Texas, very seldom do people challenge me personally. But I would say that's got more to do with the fact that Austin is just not, the culture here is not about like front stunting, you know, like dunking on people. Like I'll see in other places, sometimes there's this culture, especially in tea communities, I'll see this, where there's this kind of a gatekeeping where people just want to dunk on each other. You know what I mean? And we don't do that very much in Austin. And I think part of that's like, I don't do that to people. Our staff, Manchu doesn't do that to people. Elizabeth doesn't do that to people. Our people aren't trying to show off and dunk on people. And so very seldom do I get people trying to challenge me. And also, like, Austin's a small and new tea community. It's not like well established. There's not people who are older than me in this community who have been doing this longer than me in this community. But I remember when Steve and I came back from China from that same trip, this was in 2013 or something like that. We came back with some Saigon Hong Cha, some sun-dried red tea from Yunnan. And he brought it back to Santa Cruz with him, which was my home tea community. That's where I got into Gongfu Cha, was in Santa Cruz, California. And he brought back this Saigon Hong Cha. Saigon Hong Cha it's from Yunnan, and it doesn't get cooked. There's no baking or roasting of the tea to finish it. It is just massaged, oxidized, and then dried in the sun. And when he brought it back and he loved it. It was his favorite red tea he ever had. He didn't used to like red tea. And I was just like so excited that he liked it. And we were just so excited to be with this trip and so happy to be in China and to be finding these things. And then he got back to Santa Cruz and he shared this red tea with the people in his tea community. And he had people telling him that it wasn't red tea because it wasn't cooked. And they were saying, well, if it's not baked, then it's not red tea. Why? Because I went online and I looked at a chart. I went on Google and I looked at a chart and it says red tea. Look, it says it right there. There's a step, it's cooking. And it's like you with the mellow yellow. Because you have read a book or you have looked at a chart or if you've watched a YouTube video does not mean that you get to decide how yellow tea is made. That does not mean that you get to decide how red tea is made. Li Shulin, the farmer who makes this tea, calls it red tea. I'm not going to call it anything besides red tea because that would be an immense disrespect to the farmer. If anyone, and this is what I always say, there's no tea pope. People want to think there's a right way to do everything in tea. There's just not. Tea culture is folk culture. It emerges. But to me, the ultimate authority on tea are tea farmers, tea masters, like real tea masters who produce tea. The people whose families have been doing this for generations and generations and generations. To me, those are the people to whom the culture authentically belongs. And I will always defer to what they tell me. Likewise, I've had people, when I've served your master's green at the tea house, I've had people be like, this isn't a green tea. This is like an oolong. And I'll be like, well, they do, oxidize it. they do oxidize it. You know, he does let it hang out for like 40 days, and it does have this really unusual processing technique. But he says it's green tea. It's his tea. I'm not going to tell anyone that it's anything other than green tea because he says it's green tea and he's the master. And I think that that's like a very microaggression form of appropriation, you know. But often I very seldom come up against that in real life, and online I'm too timid about getting attacked from all directions, which is what happens when I do call these things out, about getting attacked from all directions to really do it. Even looking at the Gong Fu Cha Facebook page and seeing when I made this post, there was a lot of shade, you know, coming my way just for making the post advertising it. And so I personally am very, I've got a baby. I don't have time to, and emotional currency to engage on that level very much. So I just mostly I don't say anything. I'd rather have this discussion here than argue with individuals.
Thank you.
Can I add something on what Sohan just said? So I think that something Sohan just said about, you know, there's these things or ideas or conceptualization got so appropriated, and then it become the mainstream. So any other, actually the origin of these, the cultures of other things, the any kind of different diversity, and come out and say, we also exist. So the appropriated idea got so big, then it dismissed everything. So this is what I was saying earlier, is about the authoritative conceptualization, which is very, very, becomes very righteous to our minds. And here I wanted to say something, highlight something, is living and growing up or being educated from the modern way of education. We think about things in a compartmentalized way. Things is about putting things into categories, and that's how we think and that's how we apply. So, but with things such as tea, or any kind of sort of, I speak for Chinese culture, right? So Chinese culture is very round. It's not, you know, boxed. It's very round. It's circle. So if you're thinking about Western gym movement, it's a line. The movement is like that. But if you think about Tai Chi, it's a movement of things. So if you're thinking about culture, yesterday I was talking about this to a friend. If you're thinking about culture as a waterfall, somebody goes to the waterfall, put a can of water into the container and take it away, and then to go and say this is conceptualize it or compartmentalize it or run scientific study about it, but it's that container of that waterfall, whereas the waterfall itself is constantly updating, it's constantly moving, it's constantly very specific to that very place. So when we look at culture, it's not really a thing that can be said that this is this, and without this, it doesn't exist. You know, it's very much, just like tea is very much about the inclusivity, is very much about the diversity of things, is very much about the stories of these people. So with that in mind, I like to ask everyone to perhaps also think about this when we look at tea vendors. You know, are they telling the stories as such, or are they putting the tea culture into a container, intellectualize it and making it authoritative, or saying this is just the only way of it, etc., etc. They could be so subtle sometimes that really requires us constantly inquiring about it.
That was awesome, Ray. Thank you so much. I just want to say I'm so glad we're doing this. I've wanted to do this with you for so long, and I'm really grateful that we're doing this. And Marco, thanks so much for moderating. I think this is a kind of Aaliyah hit it on the head, I think, in the comments, that people don't understand the difference between descriptive and prescriptive. It's like here in Texas, we say y'all. And I grew up saying y'all means you all. And I had people tell me, you sound like a redneck. Y'all's not a word. Well, it absolutely is a word. I say it and I know what it means. And when people hear me say it, they know what it means also. It means to people when they hear it, what I mean when I say it. Therefore, it's a word because I'm using it to communicate. Linguistics is descriptive, not prescriptive. It's not about rules. It's about saying, how do people communicate? And let us analyze that and characterize that. But the same is true of tea. And this is why we did, last year, we did an episode on Gong Fu Tea Cha called Unorthodox Teas. And some of your teas, you know, some of your teas, the master teas made it into there for that reason, that they're doing things in Guizhou that don't fall into this idea of how tea should be made. Why? Because they're not following rules. Those categories are not rules. They are just to help us understand. But they should never restrict us from creating. If you know, Chloe and Duyuan, who we get this cave dried Hongdao white tea from that I'm drinking. There's this idea. Well, I've had people say, well, I thought you can't dry white tea in a cave. You've got to dry it in the sun. You know, and it's like, well, okay, but they're doing it, and it's white tea. So there you go. It is. Stop being so. And I think that I want to add an asterisk. Culture can't be defined. Some cultures can be. I think Japanese culture is a good example of this. You have cultures that have taken the time to strictly formalize parts of their culture. During the Meiji era, during the Meiji Restoration in Japan, they went about deciding from this part of Japan, this is the custom and this is how they do it here. And this is, if it has to have these metrics, it has to fall under these things to be this thing. Same with, you look at Chanoyu, Japanese tea ceremony, and it is very prescriptive and specific. You have to do things a certain way or you're doing it wrong. You know what I mean? But Chinese culture is very much the opposite. I remember walking through China with my cousin and my friend who was a Canadian, but is very, very good at Chinese. And my friend and I were arguing about guokui, which is a snack food in parts of Western China. And it's this like crispy little pastry thing with like lamb and green onions. It's so good. You put it on top of your noodles. It's awesome. And we were arguing about what is the kui and guokui? What is that character? And we were arguing back and forth. And my cousin was like, you guys, we'll just Wikipedia it when we get home. And me and my friend just started laughing because like, this is not on Wikipedia. And I think that there's a major disconnect between Chinese culture and Western culture in that in the West, everything is indexed and documented and searchable. Not everything, but most things. And the emergence of this phrase, is that a thing? I didn't know that was a thing. Oh, apparently this is a thing. This is, when I was little, people didn't say that. And what I've come to understand is when people say, is that a thing? What they mean is that a thing that I could go and verify by searching for it on Google or on Wikipedia? And the fact of the matter is, while much of human knowledge is online, much of it is not, especially in China. China is much, much less formalized, much less standardized, much less documented, and much, much less indexed than the Western world. And you do have people doing things in China that everyone in this village does this, and they've been doing it for 1,000 years, and you go over the mountain to the next village and you ask them about it and they'll say it doesn't exist. You know what I mean? And that's China for you. And if you're talking about tea culture, you're talking about Chinese culture. If you're talking about Chinese tea culture, you're talking in this world that is kind of this cloud of meaning. It's not these distinct concrete objects like the Western mind wants. The Western scientific systematizing mind wants answers. They want, this is the right way to do it and this is the wrong way to do it. And I think much of what happens, much of this appropriation comes from a place where the Western audience is seeking this out, and it's not forthcoming from Chinese culture itself. And so people like the person I was describing in Taiwan, they step in and they seize control. They say, oh, there's no authority on this. I'll be the authority. People want this certainty. They want these answers. They want they want someone to tell them this is the right way to do it. And if anyone does it different, they're doing it wrong. That doesn't come from actual Chinese people about tea. And so for the most part, and so, and maybe it does, but they'll disagree with each other and there's no right or wrong, at the end of the day. And so when you have this ambiguity and somewhat of a confusing field, it's a huge opportunity for certain individuals to come in and say, okay, I'm the authority, trust me. I say this is the way things are, and now you can tell people they're wrong. Now you can go out into the world and you can dunk on people and say, oh, you're wrong, because my lineage, my master in my lineage says this. And if you say this other thing, you must be wrong. And like I was saying in our conversation a couple of weeks ago, Ray, have you ever heard anyone in China use the word lineage to talk about their tea practice? No. Buddhists have lineages, Taoists have lineages, esoteric practitioners have lineages. The use of the word lineage and talking about what lineage you come from in tea culture is, as far as I understand, something that has only arisen with the Western interaction with tea culture, for the most part. And it makes me very curious. Nobody ever asks really, whose lineage is this? You see usually a Western person saying, I am the last inheritor of this lineage. I represent this lineage, and it was given to me by my master, but nobody ever talks about the master. Where is this master? Who are they? Are they alive? Are they conveniently dead? Do you have any pictures of you two together? Do you have anything that they wrote? Do you have any recordings of them? But they're given the benefit of the doubt. There's this assumption, oh, this person says that they're the master of this lineage, and I'm just going to believe them because they don't look like the kind of person who would lie. They look like me and they look honest. And yeah, that's I'm not sure how far the last plot of like 3 different Marvel movies. Yeah, that's very. Whenever I hear someone talking about lineages in tea, my ears perk up. I'm like, oh, go on. I'd love to hear about this lineage, but yeah.
I wanted to add a little bit on this is about teacher, right? You don't talk about lineages, but there's always somebody who made this tea. There's always a place, there's always a person. So this reflects to me, like if I were to buy tea, whoever doesn't give that information to me, I just won't buy tea from them, but that's just from my own sort of my own reasons, right? So I wanted to share a little bit on sort of the teachers in terms of a good teacher. There's one sitting behind me here. This teacher would never tell me this is how things are. Very much the opposite. This teacher will say, don't ask me questions. Answers for lazy people. Why don't you go and find out yourself? So anything that is said, it's said with great doubt. So for you to go and experience it, for you to make a judgment yourself. And so as my journey of learning tea, the first 6 months, I wasn't really allowed to ask questions, but just drink tea. This is because these teachers, they know that if they tell me anything, I would compartmentalize it because I was partially educated in the West. And that is very risky for somebody who wanted to just come in for information. So you grasp so hard on the information, you forget your relationship with the tea, the very simple thing for you to go and experience. So nowadays, I use that as a compass for me to examine anybody who says they are a teacher. So I will question their methods. I question the way they teach. And my teacher always says, don't question, don't always question the methods. question the teaching of it, the teaching, how you teach it. So I sort of always see, and it's really agitating for me to see all these authoritative figures out there, including the British, who set up the rules to say these are the teas, and these are these kinds of teas, and if they don't taste like this, they're not teas, or you can't be selling tea in 5-star hotel, such as us, like Grass People Tree. You know, you don't play the game, you don't play the standards, you don't get to play it. So I think that's one of those very extreme cases, which is very dominating in the tea industry at the moment. But there's also a lot of subtlety in how one teaches, how one shares the information. And it brings out the question of, what does it serve? Does it serve this person's personal image, profit, or some kind of ego-related things? Or is it just about itself? What's the intention of the teacher? So I think those are things I really look out for when I'm looking to learn or to sort of sift through.
I just want to comment real quick. That's a really good question to ask. What is the motivation for doing this? Well, I can see a very good motivation. If you're someone who sells tea, I can see why you would have a very strong motivation to characterize everybody else's tea as toxic, right? Like my experience. Oh, all tea in China is toxic except for the tea that our master gets for us. Well, there's a very strong motivation there to say that, because then you are effectively cutting off your customer base from your competition, if you see it that way. You know, and I don't like to perceive the world of tea as being in competition at all. You know, and I know you don't either. This is like part of why what I love about tea community. But there are, you know, those factors out there, those economic factors that people are brought up with that are still very, you know, defining. And then same with you know, not sharing who is the real master. Well, the real master is that guy sitting behind you, because he makes the tea. You know, that's the real master, and you don't have to go far to look for him. And you know him, you study with him, and it's the same with and as here's the thing, I'm actually not the real master. I'm not a tea master, and I say this all the time. I'm not a tea master. I'm a tea server. I'm a tea merchant. I'm a tea aficionado. I'm a tea lover. I'm not a tea master because I don't make the tea. The real master is the one who makes the tea, because without them, there is no tea culture. There can be a million Sohans can come and go, and tea will still exist. But without the master, like Lin Master, without the people making it, no more tea for anybody, because they're absolutely essential. And so
76.
And so I think that also the point of like, who is the master? When I see people who open tea businesses in the West, and I know they don't speak Chinese, I know they've never been to China, and they're selling these Chinese teas, it makes me very, very curious. Where do they come from? Did they get this on Alibaba? Which is fine, but just say that. You know what I mean? If what you have is something that anyone who has access to the internet can get, that's fine. You're curating a collection, but say that. And I see a lot of people who are selling tea and they don't know the person who made that tea. And that's fine. But that needs to be transparent, because it's different than what you do, Ray, for example, and what we do here. Like Cai Nushi, the wife of Li Shulin, she does the same thing. She'll serve us a tea and say, and I'll say, you know, we'll be like, what is this tea? And she just shrugs and she says, Rang cha shuo hua, let the tea speak. You know, just drink it. What is the tea? Drink it and you will know what it is. It doesn't matter what it's called. What it is what it is to you when you drink it. And I think that's very, and she's not charging $3,500 for a workshop to tell me that, you know what I mean? She is just having tea with us. And And I'd like to, I have kind of a thing that I want to kind of ground back into something real quick. And I don't know what's next on the docket, Marco, but I kind of wanted to bring it back around a little bit to, I saw someone ask what the purpose of this discussion is. And I just want to ground a little bit in that real fast. I'll try to keep it very short. But for me, my goal in having this is not to make people feel like tea culture is not for them. It is the opposite. My goal in having this is to make everyone feel comfortable and safe in enjoying tea culture because they understand where the bumpers are. You know what I mean? They understand what's in line and what's out of line. And I'm not deciding that. People are free to do whatever they want. But if people want to be sensitive to how people like me and Ray and other Chinese descended people feel about the expression of our culture, then this is how we think about it. This is what we find acceptable and unacceptable. And you know, at the end of the day, what me and Ray, speaking for myself and speaking from what I know of you, Ray, from the time that we spent together, is that we want to share tea culture. We want everybody to be participating in this culture. I'm not trying to put up fences and borders and say, no, you can't come in. Exactly the opposite. Inclusive, make this for everybody. And I think that most of the areas that we really see that really get into the realm of appropriation for me aren't in the realm of everyday people just enjoying tea. If they have an authentic love for tea and they just earnestly want to enjoy tea, I don't think that's appropriative or even has very much capacity for being appropriative. Honestly, I think that when someone starts to make money from it, that I start to be like, okay, we're getting close to the edge here. How close are we getting to the edge, and how is this person going to behave themselves when they get close to that edge? And yeah, I want to give it back to you, Marco. But I do have like a little, I have my own systematic way of distinguishing appreciation from appropriation that I definitely want to make sure that I get to before the end of this discussion. So I don't know if that's the time for that is coming up or where, but I'm going to give it back to you, Marco.
Yeah, thank you. And we can, this last question, this will be the final question then before we open it up to the Q&A segment. So everyone that's in here in the audience, feel free to send your questions and thoughts through the chat. If your question is for a particular individual like Sohan or Ray, please add that to the comment. If you'd like to voice your question into the room, I'm also going to ask that you raise your hand using the reaction function when it comes to the Q&A time. So I know there are a couple great questions that have started coming through already. If you'd like to voice that, just raise your hand after this last question comes through. And then I'll ask you to unmute so you can speak. And Sohan, this will go kind of to what you were leading into. In both of your views, Sohan and Ray, what are some of the key antidotes to this conversation in the context of what you do? I think this is, you just touched upon this, but that there isn't going to be a list from this discussion. It isn't right, I think, for us to say, what is the bullet point list that you get to walk away at the end of this conversation and say, as long as I follow these things, I'm not going to be, I'm exempt from this, the messiness and the reality of this. So a little bit of just padding that is what I'd like to do, because, it's fluid, it changes. This is merely based on the personal experiences of these individuals in this room. So that's the last one. In your views, what are some of the key antidotes to cultural appropriation into the context of what you do? And that can also go into your last point, Sohan.
Okay, so this is something I've been thinking about for a really, really long time because of these experiences that I've had, and And I think these are the things that when I personally am trying to distinguish between something being appropriative and appreciative, this is what I think about. One is, what is the relationship between the two cultures? That's the culture of the participant and the host culture. So let's say that I want to go and learn, let's say I want to go to Paraguay and learn about yerba mate, for example. In this case, I'm the participant because I'm participating in the host culture. And so what is the relationship between my culture and Paraguayan culture? Well, there's not much of one that I know of. As a Chinese American, I don't think China and Paraguay had much to do with each other. But when you look at a situation like a white person wearing dreadlocks, this is a very sensitive issue. And I'm not personally making a comment on whether I think this is appropriate or not. But when you look at that issue, people often say, well, no one ever gets mad at Black people for wearing white hairstyles. Why is it okay for Black people to be angry at white people for wearing dreadlocks? And I think that when you look at the relationship between the two cultures, that relationship is not on equal footing. You have one culture that was enslaved and oppressed and genocided, and one culture that was not. And so in the one direction, it feels more appropriative because you have what it's pointing out is the inequity between those two communities, those two societies to begin with. The wound, the trauma, has nothing to do with people's hair. It has nothing to do with dreadlocks. What it has to do is that everything that came before, and the reminder that these two cultures aren't equal. We say that they're equal, but history does not treat them equally, and they have not been treated as equal. And people from those cultures do not get treated as equal in America, anyways. You know, and that's the fact of the matter. And when I think about Chinese culture, China was not colonized by the West. It wasn't. Hong Kong and parts of Shanghai were a little bit, but by and large, Chinese people do not see Westerners as colonizers of them. You know, by and large, the attitude of Chinese people towards Western people is pretty benign and friendly. And there is not this tenderness and feelings of trauma and resentment from having had their country colonized. It's different when you talk about, for example, Japan, which did invade China, and there is still a lot of sensitivities there. But when you look at you can't just say, well, why is it okay for an African man to wear a suit and tie, but it's not okay for me to wear a kente cloth? Well, you can't pretend that the cultures of Africa and Europe are just equal and on equal footing, and that those civilizations have been given equal treatment. They haven't. And to pretend that they have is to ignore the reality of history. So that's one, is the relationship between the two cultures. And as far as tea culture goes, again, there's very little sensitivity on, like, when you see non-Chinese people wearing Chinese clothes. If you go to China as a foreigner, people will make you put on Chinese clothes and take pictures. They will do that. They will be like, put on these Chinese clothes. We love it when foreigners wear Chinese clothes. We think it's so cool. That doesn't feel like appropriation to most Chinese people, you know. And one of the reasons for that is there's not a long-standing history of oppression of Chinese people by European and American people, and that's one. Number two is the degree to which the participant has sought to educate themselves about the culture on that culture's own terms, not on their terms. Not in their language, but in the actual culture's language. Have they studied the language? Have they been to the place? Have they paid the tuition? And that doesn't have to be literal tuition. That means, have they spent the time and energy and money and resources to go to the place as much as they can? It's not always possible, but to go to the place or to the people to whom this culture authentically belongs and humble themselves and say, I'm here to learn. And, you know, a great example of this is, I know a lot of foreigners who, they do speak amazing Chinese. They really, really love tea. They go to China and they know Chinese really well. Some of them better than me. And they have made themselves, they say 中国通, like a Chinese person. you know, like a comrade of the Chinese people. And I think that that goes a long way, and that speaks to what you were talking about earlier, Ray. There's a degree to which someone who was not brought up speaking Chinese and not brought up saturated in Chinese culture, it would take many decades for that person to achieve the level of familiarity with Chinese culture and education that you would need to truly be qualified to teach as a teacher about the depth of esotericism of Chinese culture, like the elements, for example. And so when I see someone claiming to be a teacher of someone else's culture, they have to have really, really, really put in their time and energy. And for me to feel like, okay, there's a woman in New Orleans, and she's a white woman, and she runs a voodoo, what is it, a botanica, and she sells things related to the Yoruba traditions in New Orleans, and she's not of African descent, but she is ordained. She's the first non-African descended person to receive that ordination. And I am not from that culture, but I can only assume that if she's the first, and I think the only non-African person to have received that ordination, she probably has put in her time. And the people who give out that ordination, the accountability is on them. If they made that decision, then I'm just going to assume that they had good reason to do that. So I'm not going to say that you can never, ever participate in someone else's culture as a teacher, but you have to really, really immerse yourself in that culture and really humble yourself and do the time. Okay, cool. And I'll wrap it up because we're getting close on time. Number 3, where does the money go? This is really important, because if you're a British fashion designer and you go to Kenya and you see these traditional textiles, and then you go back to London and you copy them and you do a runway show and you make millions of dollars and people say that you're a genius, that's definitely appropriation, classic textbook appropriation. Why? Because you're getting the money and the credit for it. Let's say that you have that same person goes to Kenya and they purchase these textiles from those people and they make a business relationship with them, and those people are getting a fair wage for making those things. Then that's different, because the money, where's the money going? Not to this British person. Maybe she's making some money, getting money for bringing it here, but also the people to whom the culture belongs are making a livelihood from it. And that's the thing. And then the last thing I think about is, do you defend that culture and the people of that culture when they need to be defended? And this came up, this is a new one that I added last year after the Nashville shootings, in which Asian American women were targeted and murdered in a killing spree in Nashville by a man. And there was crickets from the tea community. There were these people who, they make their living off of Chinese culture, and they would not, and some of them I asked them to speak up, and they told me they would not. And it was very, very aggravating and frustrating for me. So when the time comes, are you an ally? Are you going to defend these people? And like Scott Norton, who's on here, was one of the first people that I saw doing this, and one of the first white people that I saw being actively an ally and being like, no, I'm going to stand up and use my privilege to speak up on behalf of these people. So shout out to Scott on that. And those are my 4 big ones. Is, what is the relationship between the cultures? Don't pretend they're equal, because they're usually not. Number 2, how much have you sought to educate yourself about that culture and humble yourself and learn about that culture on its own terms? Number 3, where does the money go? If it's all going to you, then there's a problem. And number 4, do you stand up and defend those people whose culture you are enjoying when they need you to help them? And those are my 4 big checks.
Thank you, Sohan. Ray, I'd like to give you the space before.
Thank you. Quickly, I think Sohan shared a lot, and I wanted to also just add a little bit, addressing to everybody who are in the room. I don't have a very big ambition of addressing to every person who drink tea, but at least everyone who's in the room shows a level of intent here. So I wanted to add one thing, is to question every statement even how I say about tea, how Sohan says about tea or culture or anything, it's never solid. Remember that waterfall example. It's fluid. So you only have deepened understanding of what it actually is. People can say Chinese culture is scammy, or people can say Chinese culture is really great. Whatever people are saying, until you actually get to China, let's say stay there for 6 times for 12 months, and then make your own judgment. Nobody can dismiss that because it's your own. And that's how we cultivate culture and carry on culture, is because we cannot just take from Instagram or from Google, Wikipedia. We have to go and obtain it ourselves. And this is something belongs to every one of us. Whether wearing the attire is right, drinking tea this way is right, it's for you to make a judgment after you've been there, you've done that, you've talked to the people, you've been to their houses, eaten their meal, whatever that is. So I think it's up to each one of us in terms of cultural appropriation and or appreciation. I think it's so important that we take that ownership to ourselves, and to say, okay, you say this about this topic, whatever that is, I hear you, but there's a possibility that it can be other ways, because I choose to experience it this way because I've been there, etc., etc. So I think then even people who are authoritative, or people who are in a less advantaged situation, then it could be more mutualizing in that way, because we remain soft. So this is the only thing I wanted to add. I realize this limited of time.
Thank you, Ray. If we will go probably a little bit over the 90-minute mark. Just there are some great questions that I want to make sure we've got time to, and also we'll be saving these so that we can continue the conversation outside of this Zoom. Chris, I know you raised your hand. I'll have you unmute, and then I'll take one from the chat.
Oh, sorry, I had to get up. It's not so much a question, but I kind of want to address both you, Ray, and Marco. You can chime in if you want. That a lot of what you said deeply resonates with me as a Chinese American man that grew up, here, and like to have your experiences and your lived experiences questioned so often, to like be cast aside and not have representation. You say you're timid, Sohan, but like every single time you have these talks, and you, Ray, as well, like it makes me feel more represented and more brave. So when I have these talks with people on my channel, like you inspire me. When you say that, like, I've been in situations where, my opinion doesn't matter until a non-racialized person comes in and puts their authority on it. Like those sorts of things resonate with me, because every single person that's experienced oppression has this wiring for empathy with each other. And that's that invitation that I see in both of you and every single one of these amazing people that are coming to the tea table with an honest interest and sincerity to learn from another culture and enjoy that beautiful exchange. So the vehicle of the tea table and the vehicle of what you both provide as cultural ambassadors, I have to say I'm really appreciative of these talks. So yeah, that's my sentiment on that. And like dealing with it, like know that no one person is going to be able to deal with harm. Like you said, there's no one way to deal with when somebody like does those sorts of things to you. And for me, like, I tend to be a lot more upfront about it and try not to be reactionary. But I do love that attitude that you have to not immediately react. I think that's very mature. But I won't take up more time. I really appreciate you all.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to jump into the chat from Matt Ritson. Can I ask, how do you feel about tea growing regions outside of China and how cultures have formed their own understandings and traditions of tea, even though it was brought about through colonialism?
I'll answer real fast. I want to hear what Ray has to say. My real fast answer is I think that it's great when other people are growing tea, even if it came from colonialism. India, Turkey, Kenya. Morocco has tea culture. They don't necessarily grow tea, but they have their own tea culture. Turkey has their own tea culture. Even the UK has their own tea culture, of course. And I'm not trying to go around telling people that they're doing it wrong ever. That's not my intention. If I go to Turkey, I've been in Turkey, when I go to Turkey, and someone gives me a cup of really strong black tea from a tea bag with a sugar cube, I drink it and I enjoy it. And I bite that sugar cube and I drink the tea the way they do. When I go to the UK and someone gives me clotted cream and scones and they're putting milk in their tea, I do that with them, But Chinese tea culture is Chinese tea culture, and it comes from China, and it is and was developed as an aspect of Chinese culture. And so when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about Gong Fu Cha specifically. This here, what we're doing, Chinese tea culture. And the question about what is right and wrong in Turkey and Morocco and Kenya and the UK is for those people to address. But I don't think that the plant itself, it's ever wrong. If you can grow tea, by all means grow tea. We grow tea here.
I think it's great. I'm currently in South Africa, and I've been to places where it's deeply colonized in terms of tea. They're still making teas from the 60s, the TCT methods. But when you meet tea people are very much alike globally. They would give everything they have, all the teas there, and they would always be open to try yours. And there's always a good get together. And I think if it's that, then because it's to do with people, grass, people, tree, 3 words come together becomes the word tea. So tea is not a tea without involvement of nature and people together. So I think within those then stems culture, which is inevitable. And I think the more, the better. But I also think it's important for those regions to be well informed about the history and their customers to be well informed. My teacher used to say, we should all be well informed by the history before we destroy it. So to go forward, then we should have that awareness of the history as well.
Thank you, Ray. And so on. Next up, Nick Concoli raised their hand.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I have a question, and then I'll kind of like give some context to it, I guess. I've been thinking about this honestly for a pretty long time now, but kind of, I guess, how do I want to phrase this question? I guess how important in general, but as a white person, how important is it to be outspoken about things that happen on social media? Because like to me personally, like it feels very not genuine to talk about this stuff on social media. And I started thinking about that because it like I was saying, it doesn't feel very genuine. So it feels like the intention behind it is not like what I really feel is true to me. but I don't know where, like, true to me, and then also trying to make a difference or make change, like, where I should stand on that.
Nick, can you clarify? Are you talking about other people sharing this topic or you specifically?
I guess maybe me specifically. Yeah, I think me specifically, like using my, like my words to talk about something in terms of like Chinese culture or tea culture, or yeah, I guess just kind of things like that.
I hear there's a sense of not sure. Are you not sure about sharing the information yourself, itself, or are you not sure about sharing it from your perspective?
I think it's from my perspective. I think it's more just in terms of talking about it on like social media, because I feel like it's hard to fully communicate intention when you're just like talking through, like if I made a post on my Instagram about something, it doesn't feel like that's something I would normally do. So it doesn't feel true to me. But it does feel important because I have the voice to like speak to a larger amount of people than I would just say like in a daily context.
Nick, when you say make a post about something, is that something like the something we're talking about today? Or is it something like, this is how white tea is made? So I think that
yes, something about like, say, appropriation, like this conversation we're having today. Yeah, thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're talking about. This is something I've observed. One, I think that allyship is the way forward. First of all, that when Ray and I, the reason we're having this conversation is because if Ray or I go out into the wild onto Reddit or whatever and say, hey, this isn't cool, we will get eaten alive, because it's like, oh, you're just trying to shut down Western, you're being racist, you're trying to shut down Western vendors and make them seem illegitimate, you're playing the race card. And I believe that, but you saying that you can't be accused, I'm assuming that you're white because you mentioned at the beginning, that you're identified as white by the people. And because of that, if you go and you advocate against something like cultural appropriation, you can't be accused of playing the race card. Instead, you will be accused of virtue signaling. Virtue signaling is a thing that exists, but it's also an accusation that has been weaponized against allyship. Anytime that I advocate against anti-Black racism, I get accused of virtue signaling. And that's okay. People can accuse me of that. But where I'm coming from is genuine, and I know that. And so it doesn't matter if people look at me and they say, oh, Sohan's virtue signaling about racism or misogyny again. Well, great, that's fine. But I'm not virtue signaling. I care about this and I'm trying to be an ally, and I don't really care if people think I'm virtue signaling or not. My personal stance is that when people, non-racialized people, non-Chinese people, etc., advocate on behalf of Chinese culture and the Chinese community, I'm hugely grateful for it. Steve Odell is really good at this. I've seen Steve many, many times who's a white person, use his voice and his privilege and the benefit of the doubt he gets from being a white person to stand up, and he's been to China many times, to say, when he hears anti-Chinese stuff being said, he's like, well, you don't know because you haven't been there, and I've been there, and everyone was really, really kind and nice and honest to me. And he gets very passionate about it, and I appreciate that. I don't think that's inappropriate or virtue signaling. I have a huge amount of appreciation. But at the end of the day, you just have to do what is authentic to you and what is a genuine expression of what you're really feeling on the inside, and you can't worry about what people think about it. But that's what I think about it.
Nick, I just wanted to add a little bit because I can only comment so much because I think this represents a very specific demographic and context, and it's very intricate in where you are and who you are and the geographic location. And I didn't grow up there, and so I can't really say for the specifics. But apart from what Sohan shared, I think coming back to the intention question and why you wanted to share this, if you literally feel like I have no choice but to share it, it means you care about it really a lot. You care about it so much. Then you need to check in, is this action I'm going to do now, does it come from a place of fear or does it come from a place of love? If you genuinely wanted to share this because you feel like share the tea love, let's say, then you can find a way to make it not confrontational by always thinking other people's, putting your, how do you say, putting in your shoes of other people's, thinking if you put this word out there, what would they think? And then I think become softer within that, within the action, to be more compassionate in a sense, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that both of your guys' answers were great. Thank you.
All right. We'll take two more. So this one's back in the chat from Javier Kanza. Hello, we are from Mexico and we have a tea business. We're still learning a lot about this and we would like to understand what kind of collaboration and participation with Chinese community would be respectful and beneficial for the Chinese community from your perspective. I will put that in the chat again right here from Javier.
I'm closest to Mexico, so I'll go ahead and answer. Welcome, Javier. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to say, well, for one thing, not all Chinese people will know about tea. You know, there's a lot of Chinese people who don't know anything at all about tea. And I think that the important thing is, you know, you might know a lot more about tea if you're someone who's passionate about it and who has sought to educate themselves about it than the average Chinese person living around you. You know, I assume that there's Chinese people where you live because there's Chinese people all over the place. But what you can do, what I do find is that people often appreciate seeing their culture being appreciated. And I think that, you know, connecting with the Chinese community where you are and patronizing their businesses and showing them that you have a genuine interest in their culture. Maybe they don't have anything about tea to share with you. Maybe they don't even like tea. You know what I mean? But showing them that you see them and that you appreciate them and that you recognize them as part of your community. Because as a Chinese person, anywhere but China, you are always seen as a foreigner. You're seen as unwanted. You're seen as unwelcome, like you don't belong. That's my experience as an American who have Chinese descent. And so I think that, you know, the best ways to go about that would be to just connect with the community where you are and tell them that you're starting a tea business. And maybe they don't have anything to add to that, but maybe they'll enjoy drinking tea with you. You know, just extend the invitation and serve them tea. Maybe they've never done it before. Maybe they've never done gong fu cha. Maybe you could be the first person to show them that.
Right. And for the last question, this comes from Scott Norton. And this is, I think, referring to something further back. So talking about that edge, are there other types of currency, such as social, that can also be a driver for what could be defined as appropriation? And I think if Scott's still in the room, so if he also feels inclined.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Ooh. Are you getting the weird echo from me?
Yeah.
Give me a second.
Have Tabu Scott.
Hello. All right, let me see if this works better. Yo.
Perfect.
Is that better? I'm sorry. Can you all hear me? Okay, very good. Sorry about the weird echo. That edge that I was referring to, Sohan, you had mentioned something, and maybe I can just kind of pull it away from that specific notion or context, or maybe that sentence that you would use the term edge, but I think more of what I was asking is, you had mentioned when people use tea and, use their sort of quote unquote authority over tea, and they themselves may not have had paid that tuition that you had mentioned, or, maybe using it and by, appropriating tea to make money off of it. Appropriation to make money off of it. I think to kind of throw a different nuance into it as well, though, and maybe you mentioned this too when you were talking about the person in Taiwan, is that there's also the concept of social currency, right? Where one might use their claim of authority over a different culture that they themselves might not be coming from, and using it to kind of feed the ego or feed their sort of like, going back to that question about, social media, getting their sort of street cred or clout, to use the term for social media. So I guess the concern that I have is that there are folks who will use and appropriate tea and tea culture and kind of claim authority over it, but they're not necessarily trying to do that for money, and instead are kind of doing it to position themselves socially. Curious to get your thoughts on that. As somebody who blogs about tea and researches tea, I constantly question myself about this too. So curious to get both of your thoughts, and also Marco, I'd love to get your thoughts as well on this. So Ray, Sohan, and Marco, thank you.
I think I don't have so much to comment, as much as, I personally sing a lot of, not necessarily for profit. Profit might be a byproduct of that. But like I said earlier, shared earlier in my own definition, a lot of it is about self-image, and the self-image is through the building of social media. And it's almost like, and I actually come across one that I don't know whether it's a generation thing. I feel like the younger generation is so very much lived in the TikTok situation, so or other channels. So I feel like there's less of a gap between what is reality and what is perceived and projected on social media. So they sometimes would think, I actually pointed out to this person, what you projected on the image isn't actually what you are. Because what you are in social media is you care about the culture, you're quoting this, you're quoting that, but on the back of it, you don't really speak the language, so there's a gap. So you're saying in the front that you're very authentic, but at the back you have very little tools for you to be authentic. So which one of these are real? Are you aware of this? So it turned out to me, this person, she wasn't aware of that at all. So I felt like it was, then we had tea together to discuss this. Then it pointed out to her, then it became very clear to her. Then she understood, provided that I knew that she was a very open person. I wouldn't just go and say that to a random person, because I knew her. So I pointed this out to her. And then she realized that. So I feel like there's such advantage for us to share tea as culture on one side, but there's also, I actually think the very dangerous side is actually social media, because we scroll so fast, and then that numbs our depth of curiosity and the depth of clarification. And we becomes very lazy, and then thinking what we see is the truth. So then I think that, you can happen on social media, or any other things, but I think it comes down to personal development, your ego, your intention, and that which requires relentless work all the time for anybody. And it's hard work and takes time, takes effort to even do a check-in every day when you go out on social media. How many of us have that sort of checklist, right? So I think I'm just sharing with my own experience, but yeah, I do see them a lot. Yeah, I'm very conscious of them.
Thank you, Ray. I want to add to that. I think I agree with Ray. Is that what it really comes down to at the end of the day is ego and intention. If look, everyone is capable of making mistakes. Throughout the course of my life, I have used discriminatory language. I've recently had to remove the word lame from my vocabulary because it's an ableist word. It's a very nasty ableist thing to say. And I never realized that. And I came to realize that when I was corrected by someone. And it doesn't feel good to be corrected, but they're right. It's not nice to say that things are lame. It's like calling something gay. It's just wrong. It's not a good thing to do. It's hurtful language. And so I am constantly having to educate myself and learn. And I think that you're out there blogging about tea and you're doing your earnest best to convey information that is truthful and well-researched. And that's there are natural limitations in your ability to do that as someone who's not from these cultures. And that's fine. That doesn't exclude you from having legitimacy in what you're doing, as long as you maintain, as I know that you do, because I know you personally, a sense of humility and openness, that I am by no means an authority on this, but I am sharing my journey. This is an expression of my personal exploration of a topic that I am interested in. And I think that when people do, like me, using the word lame by, not knowing it was so hurtful, and then being corrected and being, with humility, I am sorry, that was wrong. I will do better in the future to not use that word anymore. And I think that this is something I'd like to do a whole thing about, but in the future, I'd like to talk about more, but I've been using the phrase redemption culture as opposed to cancel culture. People need to be able to make mistakes, and they need to be able to be redeemed. And they need to be able to feel like if I apologize and I acknowledge that I did something wrong, that I'm not going to be shunned for it. I will be able to be accepted again. If you don't make space for people to be wrong, then you are driving them into the arms of bigotry. You're driving them into the arms of people who are bigots. So that's just what I have to say about that.
Thank you, Sohan. And I think, this is one that I will touch on because I write about tea and culture as well, Scott, and I've always admired the work that you do because the lens in which you use your voice has always been genuine, has always been a voice that amplifies and shares your experience with other cultures. And so, clarifying intent is important on a daily basis, I'd say. And that's something, I've been fortunate to work so closely with Ray over the past couple of years. And that has always been, whether facilitating experiences and seeing the audiences that we work with and the questions that come up, that has always been extremely important on what are my biases as a facilitator. Considering how language empowers or disempowers others, thinking about who we're bringing to the table and what voices we're using. And so, yeah, I think there's a huge responsibility. I think someone I heard a couple months ago had talked about how small their reach is within the tea community. And while that might have been the case for themselves and how they saw themselves, there's a big responsibility, that spans greater than we often know and recognize. So that's my input on it, and it's certainly something to constantly challenge ourselves and to continue that net of learning. All right. That is the last question that'll kind of wrap up the day. Thank you, Scott, for that. And yeah, this concludes the discussion and Q&A on cultural appropriation and appreciation. Again, please keep in mind that this is based on our guests' personal experiences and that we hope you continue forming your own considerations on the topic for future engagements. I'd personally like to thank Ray and Sohan for your openness and wisdom, and to each of you in the audience who, with every word of interest and enthusiasm, continue finding new ways to explore everything that tea and Chinese culture have to offer. If you are interested, of course, you can find the work that both Ray and Sohan do through their businesses at grasspeopletree.com and westchinatea.com, respectively. And feel free to keep up to date on social media. And hopefully we have another one of these. But thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. This is so special for your trust and for being here, holding the space for us to share and feel like we made a giant leap forward. And thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. And thank you, Marco and Sohan.
Thank you, Ray, for doing this. I love having you here and having this conversation with you, and Marco also for moderating. That's super, super, super valuable to have you there doing this and to be setting nice, good container around this conversation. And I had someone message me right before we started this, and they asked if we would post our Venmos because they said they wanted to donate to us for taking the time and the emotional labor of doing this. And so I told them that I would. So if anyone wants to Venmo us, I'll type it in the chat. And then Ray, if you have some way that people could directly send you money, then it sounds like this is something that people are interested in. But our Venmo is at West China Tea. I'm not asking for donations for doing this. I'm doing this because I want to. But I was asked before this started to do it, and so I'm putting it there. Yeah.
You can just go and drink some of our tea if you want.
Yeah, go buy some tea. That's a great way to support us, is to buy our tea. That is a really great way. And then follow us on Instagram. We're both very active on Instagram, and this is where a lot of this conversation happens. So if you don't follow Grass People Tree on Instagram, if you don't follow West China Tea on Instagram, then please go and check those out. This was recorded and it will be posted.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you.